From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
President Biden explains why he isn't running for re-election in an Oval Office speech to the American people. Or did he explain that? We'll tell you why the president did not say why he decided not to run. Plus, Benjamin Netanyahu gives a barn burner of a speech to a joint session of Congress that had more than 50 standing ovations. But some members of Congress stayed away, including President of the Senate, Kamala Harris, and Vice Presidential candidate, Senator J.D. Vance. And protesters roiled the streets of Washington against the Israeli Prime Minister. What does his appearance and meetings in Washington mean for the war in Gaza and U.S.-Israel relations? Welcome. I'm Paul Gigot with the Wall Street Journal editorial page, and this is our Potomac Watch podcast. I'm here with my colleagues Elliot Kaufman and Kate Batchelder-Odell, and today's Potomac Watch is a tale of two speeches on Potomac Watch. President Biden's Oval Office address is what we'll start with first. Let's listen to him explain his thinking.
I believe my record as president, my leadership in the world, my vision for America's future, all merited a second term. But nothing can come in the way of saving our democracy. That includes personal ambition. So I've decided the best way forward is to pass the torch to a new generation. That's the best way to unite our nation.
Well, I have to say, Kate, this was one of the oddest speeches I've seen in a long time, certainly from the Oval Office, and that the president kept saying, as you could hear in that clip, these are all the things I've done. These are all the reasons I deserved a second term, but yet I'm not running for one. You have to infer the reason because he didn't really say it explicitly, but the inference is he's just old. But he never really said it. He never said that there was any kind of infirmity that he felt or acknowledged, or maybe even a sudden health event, or perhaps a kind of a gradual shift in his ability to do the job for 4 more years. It was odd.
It was very odd. I mean, it felt very perfunctory. I'm out here because I have been told I need to get in front of a camera. I think there was a lot of noting that how odd his decision was to just release a letter about why he was dropping out. He had COVID, and there were some concerns about, well, is he ill with COVID? So him not being seen, I think, had turned into a political liability. So he came out and read this speech that was really just a stock speech about his political accomplishments that I don't think gave the country any more clarity on why he was stepping down. Of course, to your point, he can't manage the campaign because it requires too much stamina, and he looked unlikely to win. But I thought it was odd, and it did a couple particularly odd things. One of them was mentioning that he's going to roll out a Supreme Court reform over the next few months that will probably be wildly unpopular. Americans are not enthusiastic about court packing or adding more seats to the court. Put a real liability for Kamala Harris on the page, though maybe this just means she's on board with it. So it was really an odd speech that I don't think meant the moment, as you have somebody stepping down 100 days before an election.
The Supreme Court reform, he hasn't proposed it yet, but there have been leaks about what he's going to do. Really odd to throw that out there since he hasn't proposed it and this has no chance to pass this year, but he seems to be throwing this down perhaps for Kamala Harris to pick up the issue. But then why would you want to potentially box her in? She may not want to do that in the race, Elliot. The president did endorse her, but I'm trying to understand why he even gave this speech. He could have stuck with the Twitter feed.
Well, at some point, you do have to show proof of life, if nothing else. But I think he's looking at legacy. Because when you look at it right now, there isn't so much of it that he can really point to.
He tried.
I don't know that he succeeded. And so he's thinking about different items he could do that would be something lasting, something for his supporters to take away as a real positive. And I think he looks to the Supreme Court. He looks to ending the war in Gaza, a few things like this. Maybe he can put a marker out there and come away with some sort of legacy establishing accomplishment.
It all makes you wonder what his position would have been in terms of legacy, in terms of the consideration of the voters, if a year ago or 18 months ago he had said, all right, I'm only going to serve this one term. I had said that I'm a transition figure when I ran in the first place, and I realized that another 4 years until I'm 86 would be too much to ask, and so I'm ceding the field to others in a younger generation. You would have had the vice president get in, of course. You would have had any number of other Democrats probably challenge. And I think the president's reputation would have been in a much better position, Kate, than it is now, where in essence he has to disguise or not explain the real reason he's been ousted, because it's quite embarrassing. And the reason he was ousted, it's very clear, is because the Democratic establishment, all of his pals, Nancy Pelosi, Barack Obama, maybe not Barack Obama, such a pal, but Barack Obama, Hakeem Jeffries, Chuck Schumer, his allies certainly in passing legislation on the Hill, all basically concluded that if Joe Biden was at the top of the ticket, he was taking them all down. So they said, sir, you're going to have to leave. And that's the real reason he left. And he can't admit that, I guess, not willing to. And he's also not willing to admit that everybody really was covering up for his growing infirmity and difficulty, except that debate had exposed it on June 27th. And the American people had figured it out beforehand, but that debate solidified that view of him in Democratic voter minds. Kate.
Well, I agree. And I mean, one reason that it might have taken him so long to get out in front of a camera, signs of life, like Elliot said, is he was mad at this treatment he'd received from what he perceived to be his own political allies and how long they insisted that he go. I mean, he really did try to ride out their calls for him to leave and was unable to do so. I do want to add one more thing on the legacy point that we were discussing. I thought one of the most startling lines of the speech was when he triumphantly claimed that he was one of the first presidents in a century who could report that the United States is not at war anywhere in the world. This is a pretty outrageous line, given that the United States really is at war with the Houthis in the Red Sea. And we have U.S. ships that are operating inside the engagement zone of Houthi drones and missiles on a daily basis for months at a time. And when these ships come home, we're giving them combat ribbons, and we're talking about how they're operating at paces that they haven't seen since World War II. So I thought that was a really revealing remark, because he really wants that to be part of his legacy, really wanted Afghanistan to work out a different way than it did. And it's just revealing that he tried to cover up this basic reality that everybody understands, which is that the U.S. is engaged in combat in the Middle East, and also that the world is not a safer, calmer place than it was when he took over.
All right, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about the president's farewell, along with its implications for the Kamala Harris campaign, and we'll also talk about Benjamin Netanyahu's speech to Congress when we come back. Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot here with the Potomac Watch podcast, and I'm here with Kate Batchelder-Odell and Elliot Kaufman. We're talking about the president's farewell speech and its implications for Kamala Harris. Elliot, what do you think the way the president has left the stage affects Kamala Harris? Because in the one sense, it's really been a big lift for her because she hasn't had to have a primary. She can go on and set her own agenda. On the other hand, he really hasn't given her a lot of running room to set her own agenda and her own profile here in the last 100 days.
Right. And so given how unpopular President Biden had become, she wants to do what she can to separate herself from that. But she can't separate herself from it too much because she's the vice president. She is number two, has been the whole way, and wants to take credit for whatever accomplishments she can point to. So that is a tricky spot. I think more than anything, what she'll like to do is talk about certain issues that work for her. Abortion is one, could be a winning issue for the Democratic Party. Donald Trump, a focus there, could be a winning issue. A focus on President Biden is a losing issue for her. So the more President Biden keeps himself in the news with new policy pronouncements, initiatives, and things like that, I think that'll put Kamala in a very difficult spot.
I wish that he had also said something about the next 6 months, other than saying, I'm going to propose these domestic reforms. If he had said, look, I'm going to finish this up. Don't worry, folks. I'm in good shape. I'm able to handle this job for another 6 months. Don't worry about it. I've got a good team around me. And by the way, adversaries, Kate, don't take advantage of this because we're united here and we will not back down. Don't try to exploit this lame duck period. But he didn't bring himself to say that. And I think that would have been reassuring to the American public.
Absolutely. It would be good if Republicans in Congress would also back that message up as well, because it does look like a tumultuous period of time where the U.S. is in transition, and you don't want adversaries to exploit that. And I mean, in addition to the Middle East that we've been talking about in detail, the Ukraine war continues to be a live, dynamic fight where Vladimir Putin is launching missiles into Ukraine that sometimes wander close to NATO territory. I mean, the number of things that you can imagine here are high. And so that would be a good message, but it also, you know, if he were done a year ago, to your point or your counterfactual point, if he were done a year ago, he also would have had a much freer hand to focus on some of these threats to the country and do the right thing about them, regardless of what the polls said, without worrying about his progressive flank on Gaza. And that would have been better and more stabilizing for the country.
All right, let's turn to Benjamin Netanyahu's speech to a joint session of Congress. It was long planned, but Kamala Harris, president of the Senate, did not show up. She was out campaigning, and J.D. Vance, senator, also did not attend. My personal opinion is that was a mistake on both their parts. When you get a major ally involved in a conflict like that, you ought to show up. You know, somebody could have postponed this or that campaign appearance. Several Democrats, though, prominent Democrats, boycotted the event, and several accused Netanyahu of war crimes or committing genocide. Bernie Sanders, Rashida Tlaib, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and the boycott included the likes of Chris Van Hollen, senator of Maryland. Let's listen to one of the prime minister's messages, and this about protesters in the streets in America.
For all we know, Iran is funding the anti-Israel protests that are going on right now outside this building. Not that many, but they're there, and throughout the city. Well, I have a message for these protesters. When the tyrants of Tehran, who hang gays from cranes and murder women for not covering their hair, are praising, promoting, and funding you, you have officially become Iran's useful idiots.
That line went over well with a big part of the Congress, Elliot. And of course, the streets were full of protesters engaging in sometimes ugly protests, burning American flags, spreading awful stuff in a hotel where Netanyahu was staying. But just one quick factual point. Is there evidence that Iran is funding some of the American protesters?
We have some U.S. intelligence findings saying that. So there is reason to believe it. How widespread that funding is, we don't know. We know that Iran supports those protesters. We have statements from Iran's supreme leader thanking them on the U.S. campuses, on the streets, for all that they've done to further the cause. And he actually cheekily suggested that they open the Koran next and learn some more. And, you know, he would be glad to welcome them. Certainly, I think the way they function, they don't need to be funded by Iran. They are useful idiots. They're more than happy to serve that cause, even if they don't know it.
Was it an effective speech?
I think it was a very effective speech. And you can look at it for different audiences. An American audience would have heard Prime Minister Netanyahu speaking as an ally, as someone who is grateful to America for its support, grateful to President Biden, grateful to President Trump, as someone who wants to fight enemies who are America's enemies too, who say death to America and who act that way as well. And so I think seeing members of Congress standing up, applauding, and rightly applauding pro-American strong messages, all of that helps. Israelis see that too. And so that looks good for Prime Minister Netanyahu on his end as well. And so it's an effective speech there. The question is, will it change U.S. policy? For that, some more will be needed, a personal touch, meetings coming up. That we have yet to see.